Welcome everybody, and in today's lesson we are going to be talking about CSS display and the max width property. So we are going to be looking at what the display is, and the display actually specifies how an element is displayed, right? So by default, every element has a display value, right? So we're going to see how we can tweak these display values and what they do. Okay, so the first one is block elements. And block elements are elements that always start on a new line and takes up the entire width available. So we're going to take a look at some of these block elements, and some of the ones that we will be looking at are the div, the h1. These are all block elements because they take up the entire width of the space that they occupy. The form, the header, the footer, and the section. These are just a few uh, of the block elements that we have. Now we also have the inline elements, and these do not take up the entire width and they don't start in a new line. And so we're going to be taking a look at some of those also. And specifically, some of the ones that we'll be looking at will be the span, the anchor, and the img, the image tags. So these are all inline, and there are some that we are not going to discuss, but there are a lot more. And I think I talked about it extensively in the HTML class. So you can take a look at that if you want to know more. So that is what we are going to be working on. So, like I said, the default value for most elements in terms of the display default is either block or inline. And so we're going to be taking a look at some of these. So I have an HTML here that I just pulled from w3schools.com, and it just tells us, it just shows us some on ordered list, right? So you can see the on ordered list, right? And then we are using the li, right, which we know to be a block element. So you can see that every list element is the li, right, tag. And so we have the html for one. The next one is css, and then javascript is the third one. So each of them occupy the whole space, right? You can see that it's the whole line that it occupies, and the next one just goes to the bottom. It starts from a new line, which I said is the characteristics of block elements. So this started on new lines, this started on new line. That's the default characteristics of block elements. So what we are going to do now is to change this from a block element to an inline element. And the way we do that is we go back to the style. I'm gonna tag it the li element, and in here I'm just gonna say display, change from block as you can see, but now give it to me as inline. Right. So I'm changing this from a block element, each of these LIs, to inline. And so when I refresh this, it now looks like uh, a horizontal menu, right? And so that's how we create horizontal menus, by just changing the default display to inline, right? And so you can see that each of these don't no longer occupies the entire width of the space, but it only occupies just as far as it can go, right? And so this CSS just stays on the same line, and then the JavaScript also attaches itself to it. And that's how the inline works. It does not occupy the entire width of the space available. So let's look at the reverse. Let's look at uh, a block, an inline element, and let's try and turn it into a block element. And I am going to be looking at the span element. So I'm going to have a span, and I'm going to say this is a span, full stop. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another span just after this span. right? And I'm gonna say, please code with me. Okay, so this, I know this sounds outrageous, but it's fine. I can't think of anything better right now. So I'm gonna refresh this, and you can see that because by default the span is an inline element, it's all on the same line, right? This first span does not occupy the entire width, and maybe because, let me just do this so you can see, right? If I do this, it stays the same, right? Because the span just occupies just the space that it can. So if I just say something like this, it's just gonna increase because it just occupies the space that you give it, right? Okay, so this is an inline element, and as you can see, it doesn't start from a new line, right? It just continues with the space available, and it just uses only the space that it can fit, right? Okay, so let's try and make this a block element. So here, all I have to do is to select the elements, and then I change the display from the default, which is inline, to block, right? And so when I refresh this, because this is a block element, I'm expecting it to occupy the whole line, right? And push this one down because, again, a block element always starts from a new line. So if I refresh this, voila, you can see that this started from a new line. Just as a quick aside or a quick note, setting the display property of an element only changes how the element is displayed. So it's just how it's displayed, right? Not what kind of element it is, right? So an inline element, right, with display block. So because this is an inline element, but I have changed it to a block element, it doesn't mean that I can have other elements inside it, right? For example, if I have a div, I can have other elements in a div because a div is a container and it holds other elements, but it doesn't change the characteristics of the element, right? So just keep that in mind. Now, what if we wanted to hide an element, right? One will say, why do we want to hide an element? There are so many times we want to hide an element, so we just need to know how to do it, right? For example, and sometimes you want to be able to use JavaScript to hide and unhide an element based on certain conditions, right? So you should be able to know how to do it. And I have this P element here that says display a list of links. Let's see how we can hide this and how we can make it visible and invisible. Okay, so there are two ways we can do this. The first is setting the display of this to none, right? So if I just and maybe I should tag this P, and then in here all I can do is display, and I'm gonna set this to none. And if I refresh this, it's no longer there. It hides it from display. So it hides it. There's another way you can do this, but there's a subtle difference between the two, and we are going to take a look at that. So I'm just going to say, and to do this, we use the visibility attribute and set that to hidden. Okay. So just so we can see the difference, I'm going to comment this out. And then we are going to see the visibility is equal to set hidden to visibility and see how that is going to look like. So see how there is no space, like there's no element on top of this. If I refresh this, you can see that the space is there. It means that the element, the space occupied the element is being preserved. So again, hiding an element using display, setting display to none, will be treated as if the element is not there, right? But if you set it the visibility to hidden, then you still hide the element, but it's gonna the space is gonna be treated as if the element is there, right? So that's the two subtle differences between the two. So like we said, a block element always takes up the full width available to it, right? So it stretches far right and far left and occupies the entire space, right? But we can set the width of the block element uh, to prevent it from stretching all the way, right? So if you wanted it to just be of a certain width, you can set the value, right? And then you can also set the margins. If you wanted it to be centered, what you can do is that you can set the margins to auto, right? And it's gonna horizontally center the element within the container that it resides. So that is one way you can do it. So the element will take up the specified width that you have given to it, and the remaining space that will be split equally between the two margins if you use margin set to auto. And we are going to take a look at that. Right. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to create some space. Let me do a break. Create some space, and I'm going to have a div. And what is a div? A div is a block element, right? And in this div, I am going to just put some text. Let me put that with lorem, right? Just to occupy space. And I'm going to define a class for this called class equal. Uh, Maybe, what should I use for this? Um, Max or something. Let's call it max1. Okay, so if I refresh this, it's only going to be text. Okay, good. So what I want to do with this is I want to set a width. So I'm going to tag it max1, and because it's a class, I have to use the dots to specify that it's a class, right? And in max1, I'm going to set a width, and I'm going to set this width to 50%, right? So it's going to occupy 50% of the space available. If I refresh this, you can see that it occupied 50% of the space available. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have a margin, and I'm going to set this margin to auto, meaning that it's going to split the rest of the space equally, right and left. So if I refresh this, you can see that it kind of centers it because the margins have been split equally. And just to make this a little bit more visible, I'm going to put a border, and this is the shorthand, 30 pixel. I'm going to put a solid, and I'm going to put what color? Orange red. Okay. So if I refresh this now, we have this. Good. You can also use so instead of 50%, say you wanted it to be about 800 pixels. You can also do that. You can specify the width however you want it, right? So that is your uh 800 pixels width. Again, so what I want to do now is I am going to create another div, and I can just copy this and call this max2. And just so you know how it looks like, I just copy this so you can see, right? And then maybe I should add a break here just so we can see the separation, right? And then I'm going to also style this, but I'm going to use the max width here because I want to show you guys the difference between using the max width and not using the max width, right? So I'm going to set max width to say 500 pixels, and then I'm going to set the margin to auto, and then I'm going to set a border, to 3 pixel, solid, and then orange. Maybe I can use the actual orange this time. So if I refresh it, you can see that this has been set to a max width of 50 pixel, 500 pixels, and the margins have been auto done for you, so it centers it in the middle of the container, right? And you have your margin. The problem with this first div occurs when the window size is smaller than the width of the element, right? So we said this was max 1 was 800 pixels. When the window size becomes smaller than 800 pixels, right? It adds the browser adds a horizontal scroll bar to the page, right? But when we use the max width instead in this situation, the browser doesn't do that, right? You have that window size all the time, right? And so it's very usable when you're having small devices, right? So the tip is, if and we can look at this right now. Let's try and resize this window. Let's just try and make it smaller. Yep. You can see that it introduces this toolbar here because the size of this, right? But with the max width, it doesn't go any further, right? So if I try to go, it doesn't, right? So it just helps for smaller devices that you want to preserve the readability, the UI friendliness in on all devices, right? So thanks for watching and see you guys in the next lesson. Bye.